welcome to Matchbook Flashback. If you're one of the kind souls who has already listened and given us a 5-star rating, I have to thank you so very much. That really helps the show grow. If you're a newcomer, well, my name is Alec Ogg, and I'll be your host. I bought this old glass jar of matchbooks at an estate sale, and the matchbooks are all different colors and designs from all different times and places. And the strangest thing happens when I light the matches. The flames begin to swirl hypnotically, and you can look deeply into the flame and see a story in there, trapped like a memory in the matchbook. Well, I suppose that's what you all came here to see, so let me grab a matchbook from the jar. I'm reaching deep down. Oh, interesting. This one is blue, and on the flap side it says in a yellow font, quote, "Going up north." And on the back cover it says Northern Michigan 2018. And there's a little lake graphic with a tent and pine trees, like a little campground. Northern Michigan. Northern Michigan always reminds me of the legend of the Michigan Dogman. It's a creature from the lore of lumberjacks up there in the 1800s, with many reported sightings through the 1930s and the 1950s of a half-man, half-dog that walks upright on 2 legs and terrifies people with its howl. But I digress. Let's strike a match from this 2018 Northern Michigan matchbook. Now, when I light the match, I need you to look deeply into the flame. Look deeply into the flame.
I'm a diesel mechanic. I work on Class 8 semi-trucks. So I'm a heavy-duty tractor-trailer mechanic. If you don't know, riding dirt bikes and four-wheelers and things like that is a very long time-honored tradition in Michigan. There's got to be minimum a few thousand miles of off-road vehicle trail that's state-owned in the lower peninsula of Michigan. And then if you were to look at ORV maps of the upper peninsula, there's hundreds of miles of ORV trail up that way as well. So off-roading is something that I've been doing since I want to say 6 or 7 years old. I've been on a dirt bike, and over time, I just kind of leaned more towards the quads. But 2018, winter of 2018, January, I bought a brand new four-wheeler, first brand new one I ever got in my life. I was in my early 30s. I think I was like 32 or 33 when I got it. Like I said, I bought it in January, and we had a pretty mild winter that year. So I was taking this thing out like every chance that I had, and we had a bit of a break in the weather in April that year, and I decided that I was going to go to this campground that's it's outside of a town called West Branch. It's about a 3 or so hour drive north of where I live. I've been to this place many, many times over the years. This campground, it's about probably 5, maybe 6 miles off the highway outside of town just to get to it. It's pretty out of the way. It's probably 10, 12 miles away from the town. It can be pretty isolated out there. On my way back into the campground, I had to take dirt roads to get back in there, and these roads are pretty messed up from there's a lot of logging trucks that come in and out of there during the logging season. So the roads are pretty rutted out. I had to flick my truck at 4x4 just to get back there. And this is all snow melt water that I'm running through. And I was going through some water holes that were like knee deep. And I'm like, okay, God, please don't let me get stuck out here because like I don't have cell service or nothing. So at the time, the leaves on the trees hadn't started to grow back yet. And it was still getting down to like 25 to 30 degrees at night. So I left home right after I got off of work at like 2 in the afternoon. So I got up there at about 7 o'clock at night and I couldn't find any dry firewood. I had stopped and gotten something to eat on my way up. So I wasn't getting ready to make a fire because I was cooking dinner or whatever. So I couldn't find any dry firewood and I'm setting my tent up. So no fire that night. And as I'm setting my tent up and getting my camp set up, I'm hearing stuff fall in this lake. Now, this campground sits on a lake that runs, I want to believe it's northeast to southwest, so kind of at a diagonal. Like I said, it's early spring in northern Michigan. It's cold, it's damp. It was kind of a partly cloudy day. There wasn't much of a breeze, just kind of a light breeze. It wasn't very windy. And over the course of the evening, I get my tent set up. I try to get a fire going. I can't find any dry firewood. And it was just kind of like so muddy and miserable that it was a waste of a trip.
So was there snow on the ground?
Yes, there was, in patches.
Okay.
Like in the shadier areas. Like if it was like all the snow along the beachfront of the lake was gone. And like pretty much like anywhere where there would have been shadows overcasting from the trees, there was still snow on the ground here and there. Like, but it wasn't like, there wasn't like 4 inches of snow 100%. So it was about half covered.
Okay.
So one thing about this was around this campground, it gets used very heavily in the summertime because it connects directly to a pretty popular ORV trail that can take you for miles and miles in any direction. There were snowmobile tracks through the area, but I didn't notice like any fresh tire tracks. So I've kind of always thought that nobody had been through there in quite some time, and certainly nobody had stayed there since probably sometimes hunters will stay there during deer season. And yeah, there was just no signs of anybody having been there in months. So, like I have stated 100 times already, I couldn't get a fire going, so I just decided to go to bed. And at this point, it's about 9 p.m. Over the course of this evening, I was hearing stuff fall in this lake. I didn't think anything of it because this is the time of year that like the Canadian geese are sort of making their way back north. So you'll see flocks of them out and about, and other migratory birds, because that's like the start of duck season is in the early spring. So you'll see birds, geese, and just other waterfowl out. But I don't recall seeing any that afternoon. So I thought that the things I heard falling in the lake were just tree branches breaking off and falling. But I don't recall like ever seeing like the splash from one of them. And there was a few of them that sounded like they were like just way, way too far out in the water for it to have been a tree branch falling. Now, this is also a time of year like the fish aren't jumping because it's just too damn cold. So 9 o'clock, I go to bed. I get zipped up in my sleeping bag. I'm laying on a cot. And I fall asleep. And whenever I go camping, I always wear a glow-in-the-dark wristwatch. For whatever reason, I woke up. I look at my watch, and it was 1:15 a.m. And I'm laying there, and I'm like, okay, whatever. I'm trying to go back to sleep. And I hear these calls that sounded like the biggest wolf. I mean, I've never seen a wolf in Michigan. I know the population has been starting to come back in the past few years, but I don't know if there's been any spotted in the area that I was in. But what I heard sounded like a wolf howling, like your typical, like a wolf howling at the moon in a movie or whatever. So this is coming from the north end of this body of water. And it was not a coyote. I've heard coyotes many, many, many times in my life. I know what kind of sounds they make. Whatever this was, it sounded like the biggest fucking dog I've ever heard make any kind of noise. So I'm like, okay, cool. That sounds like a wolf. Like, this is awesome. Like, all right, cool. So a minute or two goes by, and from the south end of the lake, I hear another call in return to the one from the north end. And I'm like, okay, this is like so. And like right then and there, I'm like, oh, wow, there's two of them out there. Possibly because like it sounded like two different calls off in the distance. So I'm like, okay, there's two, possibly three out here, one at the north, one at the south end. I'm like, all right, I'm just going to lay here for a little bit and see how this all plays out. So nothing unusual happened. And then I'm laying there waiting listening for these return calls. And mind you, it's dark out. There's no moonlight. And when anybody that's ever been out in the woods at, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning and you're miles from town, it is pitch black. I was laying there waiting, like just listening to these calls. And then I noticed like it gets completely silent, like deathly. You could have heard a pin drop 100 yards away, quiet. And this is the part that always has stood out as like just completely bizarre. I don't understand this. I'm laying there, and like I've said, I notice it gets deathly quiet, and then it was just like this eruption of noise. Where every single bird, mouse, squirrel, rabbit, deer, whatever animal was in those woods just like went crazy all at once, making distressed calls. And it was from all around me, like 360 degrees was like where this was all coming from. It wasn't coming like from one direction. It was all around me. I'm laying in my tent, and at this point, I instantly am like frozen in complete terror because the only thing going on in my brain is what in the fuck is going on out there? Do I want to get out and look? No, I don't. And for whatever reason, and I mean, this is like a deep primal fear that I had. I just kept thinking to myself, like, you better be quiet because you don't want whatever's out there to know exactly where you're at. This just like explosion of noise goes on for about a good 30 or so seconds. And then boom, completely quiet again. And now I'm laying there like, okay, what is going on around me? Like, this is like, what's happening here? And then I hear these footsteps. Like a bipedal rhythm comes walking right through what I'm guessing was the tree line, like because this campground kind of was like a big circle. And I hear these footsteps come walking right on through, probably give or take 60 to 100 or so feet away from where I was. Goes walking, comes up from the south, heads north, and then slowly tapers off into the distance to where I can't hear it anymore. So I lay there all damn night. Sun comes up about 6 o'clock. I'm wide awake. I am still struggling to grasp what just happened to me. Like I've got nothing as to what this was. So I get out of my tent. I looked around for a little while and looked for footprints. I looked for any sign that something had passed through there, or I don't know, a dead animal or whatever. I just looking for signs of anything that could have caused that kind of disturbance. And I never found anything. And I ended up just saying, screw this. And I packed it up and got the hell out of there. And I've been back there since, but I've never stayed the night there.
So when you were in the tent and there was that eruption of noise, did that primal fear set in during the eruption of noise?
No, it was before that when I noticed the dead silence. When right around that time that I figured out that it was a little too quiet. That's when it was like I froze. It was like a level of fear that I've never felt before. And I remember just like trying, like I even caught myself like slowing my breath down. That's how quiet I was trying to be, is like I slowed my breathing and I was doing my best not to move because like I'm zipped up in a sleeping bag. And I'll be honest, I didn't mention this detail before, but I was armed while I was out there. I did have a gun with me. I was so terrified, like I didn't even want to reach out of my sleeping bag and grab my gun, because I was that afraid of making any kind of noise or producing any kind of movement that whatever it was could have found me very easily.
And when that distress call went out, did you yourself have any impulse to like scream out as well? Like, could it have triggered everything or no?
No, with the way that it happened with me is like when I heard the distress calls, I completely froze. I mean, like ice runs through your veins, frozen in place, just going, what in the hell is going on out here?
When the howls were first happening and you thought they were just wolves, were you feeling any like internal vibrations?
When the second one fired back at the first one, because the one that was on the north end of the lake called out, and when the second one returned, it was like incredibly loud, like bass vibration that I could feel in my chest. Like those guys that have the super duper loud car stereos, and you pull up next to them at a red light and your mirrors are vibrating. It's kind of like that.
And yet it felt like it sounded like it was maybe like more than a football field away?
Well, trying to judge distance in the dark just from sound is difficult. And then once you factor in the way that sound travels over a body of water, that kind of changes things. But I don't want to put an exact number on the distance, but I can tell you it was very far away from me.
So it would be unusual. It would be very unusual for a wolf to howl at whatever distance that was and you to feel it in your chest like a bass. There's
no way. Like I've been around like animal calls and things like that, but I've never felt like that bassy vibration. And if this was in fact a wolf, it would have to have just been a monster if it was a natural animal, it would have to have been a monster of a natural animal to make that kind of a noise.
And so at that point, when it sort of is vibrating in your chest, are you still thinking like, oh, cool, these are wolves? What are you thinking at that point?
It was at that point, that's when I kind of went into that like frozen panic fear. and started thinking, what in the hell is that, and what's going on here?
Do you have any ideas on what it could be?
Well, I honestly don't know. I've thought about it a lot, especially since in the past couple of days. I've thought about this a lot, and I still to this day have no idea. Like, Michigan's kind of famous for having the dog man. Of course, Michigan Dog Man, that whole story originated in northern Michigan, I think in Kalkaska. But there's also the area that I was in. They kind of, I might be mistaken about this, but they like to call themselves the Bigfoot capital of Michigan. And historically, there have been several sightings in that region over the years. So is it outside the realm of possibility that it may have been Sasquatch? I don't know.
Did you have the impression that it was something otherworldly or something that you shouldn't be hearing or shouldn't be experiencing? Anything like that?
I definitely got the feeling that, like, this is something that not everybody gets to experience. And to further that point, I know a lot of avid outdoorsmen and hunters and people like that. And I've kind of shared this story, like the part about all the noise in the middle of the night, and to some very experienced outdoorsmen. And nobody that I know personally has ever had anything like that happen to, ever. So that's always the part that I get hung up on, was like, what caused like that? Because, like, usually, like, when you get the silence, that means one of two things. That means that, generally speaking, when the woods quiet down, that means that some kind of threat has entered the area.
Yeah, because you hear about the silence with cryptids a lot,
Yeah.
but I don't know that I've ever heard that cacophony of everything erupting at once.
And even then, like, I've listened to a lot of other Bigfoot podcasts and cryptid stories and things like that. And the common thread is always that dead silence, and then, you get that feeling like you're being watched. Me personally, the way that with the freeze in place reaction that I got out of it, like, there's three types of reactions. There's fight, flight, or freeze. Apparently, I'm one of those people that just freezes, but it was one of those moments where it was like, I felt like the worst thing I could have done in that particular time was, like, get out of my tent and start looking around, because it's like, okay, whatever this is, if I get out, now I'm exposed on all sides. Like, I'm better off staying put.
Yeah. You hear about sometimes that primal fear thing is almost like projected to people through infrasound or a pheromone or who knows what or how, but
Right.
do you share that impression that it was somehow projected into you?
I will say this, that I'm not trying to sound like Captain Badass here, but I've lived a pretty strange life, and I've been through some pretty extreme situations, and I've felt fear before, and never in my life did I feel the type of fear that I felt that night, because it was, like I said earlier, when I felt like that reverb in my chest, that's when that freeze reaction kicked in. And it was like it was like just like some caveman primal instinct, like something deep in my soul was telling me, do not move, don't make any noise, because whatever that is, you don't want it knowing exactly where you are. Like, this is the only advantage you have right now, is that it doesn't know your exact location, and you don't want it to find out.
When you were hearing stuff falling into the lake, I know you said you thought you might have justified it via being branches, but are we talking, like, did it sound like heavy things, like kerplunking into the water?
There were a few of those. There were a few times that even earlier in the evening when the sun was going down, like there was a couple of loud kerplunks that I heard that sounded like they came from the middle of the lake or far enough out that it just couldn't have been a tree branch falling in. But those loud kerplunks, I kind of wrote that off as like migratory birds landing. Like I said, this is a time of year when we've got geese and ducks moving through the area. So I thought maybe it was a waterfowl. But if you actually, like, if you see a duck or a goose land in the water, they don't just like, like how a helicopter lands, it comes straight down and boom, it hits the ground and that's it. Like you
Yeah.
watch a goose land on the water and they it's like watching a plane land. They come in at an angle and they like slowly splash their way in. They just don't like dive bomb it, right? Like they don't make that kind of noise when they land on water.
If you were to hypothesize about like the closest thing you could relate the sound to, did it sound like big rocks kerplunking in the water, or do you think it was an animal, like say this was a cryptid, was it a cryptid like splashing its feet in the water? Is there anything that you have a hunch that it felt the most related to other than what you've already mentioned?
So the only natural thing I could think of is that it might have been a fish jumping, but it would have been like this lake's just not big enough to support, these gigantic monster fish or whatever. I thought about that, but it was a time of year that the fish just wouldn't have been jumping because the water was too damn cold. This lake would have just recently have thawed out within the past few weeks when all this happened. One thing that I didn't really know about, like when it comes to Sasquatch encounters, is supposedly like when you wander your way into one's area, they'll kind of give you warning shots by throwing stuff at you, like small pebbles or acorns or something like that, like something to get your attention or scare you away. I never had anything like thrown direct. Like I didn't have like a little acorn hit me in the back of the head or something fall at my feet. But there is a part of me looking back at it and putting the pieces together that I feel like something was getting thrown in that water to get my attention. And was it the kind of deal like, are you giving me a warning shot, or are you trying to get me to look away from something? Right? Like are you trying to divert my attention?
Do you feel like there's any other details that we didn't cover?
The one thing that I always wondered about was why did I hear calls from one end of the lake and then a response back to the other? And something that crossed my mind recently within the past couple of days thinking about it was, what if what I heard was like, say if this was in fact Sasquatch, there was two of them, and what I heard was the one at the south end of the lake in distress, or was the one at the north end calling out, trying to figure out where his buddy was, like, hey George, where are you? Don't worry Bill, I'm over here, kind of thing. Were they separated for any reason? And honestly, I've read into like what infrasound is and how like tigers and different big predators can make it, and it does some weird stuff to you. So one thing I've kind of like speculated on is, did these things get separated for any reason and they're trying to get back to their central meeting point or whatever, or their den or whatever? So one thing I always thought was, or one thing that popped in my head recently was, this campground people haven't been there in several months. So if they're traveling through the area, have they kind of figured out that, okay, we can pass through here as a shortcut, there shouldn't be any people here, but then I just so happen to show up on a bad night?
When you heard the footsteps, would you say that they were heavy footsteps?
Very. It they it wasn't like, like some people say, like, oh, it came charging through the woods and it sounded like a bulldozer going through the forest. Like, no, it sounded like a gigantic man just out for a casual stroll.
And what made it sound gigantic?
The weight of it, there was a couple of pops that I heard. Like, that wasn't a tree branch, that was something, that wasn't no twig, that was something like that had to have been a good sized tree branch. Like when you break, like if you break a piece of dry firewood over your knee or whatever and it makes that loud pop, that kind of thing. And the fact that it was crunching through all the leaves and everything like that was on the ground, and it's it just, whatever it was, had some serious weight to it.
Do you think I'm asking this kind of rhetorically just to hear your response, but could a human just make those howling noises or imitate those howling noises?
I mean, maybe if you were like the best, the best wolf call guy on planet Earth, sure, maybe. But um, the only other thing I could think of is like, was somebody out there, like, have you ever been to a sporting goods store and seen like predator calls that they use for coyote hunts?
Yeah.
Like, did somebody, like, where was like Jim Bob and all of his buddies out there, they set up a whole bunch of these speakers all around the woods, and like I like wandered in on the night that they decided that they were going to test all this shit out. um I thought that like that's like, there's no way that, like, nobody would go to like this far of an extreme to just like play a prank on some guy, right? But I've thought about that. Like, what could it have been, a predator call that somebody was trying out? I kind of seriously doubt that, because it whatever it was, it came from the vocal ability of of some kind of an animal. It was way too big, and the way that, like, I felt that reverb in my chest, there's just I can't imagine what it could have been. What I heard was definitely canine. Like, it wasn't. I don't know. To me, it's kind of like you listen to the Ohio caller sound, and it, like, this is the kind of sound like a hominid would make. What I heard was distinctly canid.
If you had to guess, do you think it was a dog man?
It's like there are places up north that, like, something doesn't feel right. Like you ever go somewhere and just like something feels off. And I've been to this campground 100 times. Well, not 100 times, but I've been there a lot. Like I used to go up there with my dad when I was a little kid, and there was just something about that place that always creeped me out. Ever since I was, God, I think my dad took me up there the first time when I was like 6 or 7 years old. And I remember there was something creeped me out about the place, and I would go up there in my teen years with my parents, and there was something that creeped me out about that place. And it's just one of those spots that, like, it looks it looks like a pristine, beautiful little lake. And but when you go there and you're by yourself, and you stand out there and you kind of just take everything in, like, you get like this feeling like something ain't right here. Like, it's hard to describe, like, I don't know what sets that off.
Yeah, what keeps you coming back?
My dad passed away in 2012, so I've got some fond memories with him at that place. So I go there once in every few years. I'll go up there and think about, like, oh yeah, I remember he threw a bunch of gas on the fire that one time and almost blew himself up or whatever. Stupid shit like that.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to hear about your dad passing.
Well, thank you.
I'm not even sure what to label this one. If it'd be like the Northern Michigan just encounter or experience or creatures, howls.
That's what I call it, is just a encounter, like a Michigan encounter, because it was like, man, after it happened to me and I started like actively kind of like researching a little bit more, and just something like that, you don't have something like that happen to you and you can't help but wonder what the hell all this was. And then I started kind of like reading about like dogman and people's dogman encounters, and that's when you get into like the really far out there paranormal aspects of a cryptid encounter. I don't know, like, was it dogman or Sasquatch? It's kind of, I don't know. Like, I didn't see shit. I just heard some weird stuff.
Yeah, but boy, what you heard is strange.
And to further my point about northern Michigan being a strange place, and I'm going to sound like an absolute lunatic, but I'm 99% certain I've seen a UFO up there. Yeah, man, Michigan's a weird, weird state sometimes.
What was the UFO experience?
My father used to have his house up in a town called Gaylord, and Gaylord is about 250 miles north of Detroit. And I was up there at his property after he passed. He was gone about a year. And if you look at a map of the area, there's a town called Grayling. And Grayling, there's Grayling, Camp Grayling Air National Guard bases in this area. So sometimes the National Guard would go up there and do their maneuvers 2 weeks out of the year or whatever. And in the summertime, like, I would be able to sit on the back porch of my dad's house and watch like military aircraft, like helicopters and things like that, flying around off in the distance. And there was also a bombing range in another town. It is in Johannesburg. That's about 15 or so ish miles east of Gaylord. So the UFO happened in September of 2013. The way that the property was laid out, dad had 10 acres. So there was the road that he lived off of, then his house, and then the rest of the property kind of dipped down into a valley and went up into a hill. So I was out walking my dog at about, I think it was like 6:30 or 7 o'clock at night, and the sun was going down behind me. So I was looking west, and like my dog had been acting kind of distressed, like something had bothered her, like something's like she picked up on a bad scent and something spooked her, which wasn't unusual because there were coyotes and black bear and things like that running around in that area. And I stopped, and for whatever reason, I looked off into the west, and I see this sphere hovering above the trees that, from like my perspective, it would have been maybe 100 foot across from where I was standing. And it would look like it was about maybe, so if the tops of the trees are say 60 feet and this thing was another 100 feet, give or take, it was 150-ish feet off the ground. And it looked like it was maybe about 100 feet wide. And I looked right at it, and it starts changing colors like a traffic signal from left to right. It's sweeping, and it's going from blue to red to orange, blue, red, orange, blue, red, orange, and poof, disappeared. Didn't shoot up into the sky, didn't take off into the distance, just completely silent. And this thing just shifts colors a couple of times and poof, disappears. No, like exhaust trail from a fighter. Like you ever go to an air show and you see the planes flying around, you can see the exhaust trail from them.
Yeah.
There was nothing of that sort. This thing was there and then was not there. And I was like in complete awe, and I'm like, did I just see that? Like, what the hell? I'm like, that was something Like, no, that was like some military something or another, like the National Guards out here screwing off with like I just like I saw like something from an aircraft or whatever, right? And I ended up I ended up talking to my neighbor that lived down the road from me a couple days later, and he saw the exact same thing at the exact same time that I did, and would tell you the exact same story, that he sat there, watched it shift from blue to red to orange for about 10-15 seconds, and then poof, disappeared.
You said it was like 100 feet in diameter, maybe.
Thereabouts, yeah.
So it was a huge thing.
Yes. It would have been the size of the moon in the sky, like a full moon in the sky, hovering, give or take, 200 feet off the ground.
And did it illuminate anything else?
Not that I recall. No, it didn't. It didn't produce, like, the only light that it was producing. Like I said, the best way I can describe it is if it looked like a traffic signal changing colors, like just a sphere hovering above the trees. That wasn't. It didn't have like an aurora around it. It wasn't like shining light out of it. Like whatever it was like self-contained. It wasn't like casting illumination in any other direction.
Wow, that's bizarre. Did you feel anything or think anything when you're looking at this thing?
No, like I looked up at it, and was just like, huh, what's that? That's kind of cool. Like, and then it disappeared, and was like, did I just see a UFO? I think I did.
Yeah, how did you feel when your neighbor corroborated that?
It kind of felt like when because I ran into him a couple days after the fact. I was driving down the road, and he was out there doing something in his front yard, and I stopped, and because I didn't see the guy very often, so I would just like stop and talk to him whenever I caught him outside. And he actually was like, hey, he originally brought it up to me. He's like, hey man, did you see that thing up in the trees the other night? You think that was the National Guard out there screwing around with something? And I was like, are you talking about that sphere that was changing colors and then just magically disappeared? He's like, oh my God, you saw it too. Like, yeah.
What are you thinking when he kind of corroborates that?
It was just kind of like, it was like, oh my God, I'm not crazy. Somebody else saw this.
Oh, yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, it's a head scratcher. Thank you for sharing that, though. Do you mind if I include that in the episode too?
Yeah, sure. If you want to. I mean, why not? Why not make me look as crazy as possible?
Hey, I've told. I think every guest has come on and said, like, I'm sorry that this is going to sound crazy, but I think that's what makes these stories so fun to hear, is because of your willingness to share them anyway. And so I really appreciate your vulnerability and willingness to share them.
Yeah, I don't know. Like in your experience, I don't know about you, but it's kind of like there's some people out there that like once you have something like that happen to you, it seems like you're more prone to continue to have things like that happen to you. Or is that just me?
No, I think you're right. You hear about it all the time, that like one thing will happen in their life, like they see something, and then every couple of years they see something afterwards.
I don't know. Is it just, I've wondered, like, is it just because you're looking for it? Like, something, something is just around the corner, and now that your eyes are open for it, you're more prone. Just the idea that I've always had.
Well, as you can see, the match has gone out. As the smoke clears, I can almost smell that chilly Michigan air. What do you think those howls were? I guess only the matchbook knows for sure, but if you enjoyed those encounters, maybe you could text a link of this episode to a friend so they can enjoy it too. Or another great way to support the show is to give us a 5-star rating. It only takes one click, and it really helps this young show grow. Anyways, I really appreciate you stopping by, and I hope you come again next week because I have another match to light.